Thank you everyone for joining. As you may or may not know, this class is going to feature heavily on Star Wars. But it's not just going to be about Star Wars, it's going to be about all the little things that make Star Wars what it is. Because you see, Star Wars isn't just a movie series about space cowboys and space wizards shooting each other with lasers. Obviously, it is so much more. In fact, I think that every time I look at it, like any bit of Star Wars media, for instance, is a lot like a cathedral. You can see it from a distance, and it looks like a building of a certain kind. And then when you go in closer, you see little details on it, little paintings, little statues, and each of them is a reference to something else. So obviously, Star Wars is very, very deep with a lot of meaning and a lot of real world inspiration, which of course helps us as Jedi connect to a lot of different things. Now, I'm going to be listing a few of these things. You may already know about them, of course, and I would be very appreciative if you would pitch in. So without that out of the way, I think we can get started. There's plenty of elements that we could talk about, but I think that since this is a Jedi gathering, we should start with the meat, the subject, which is the Jedi. Now, of course, everybody knows that the Jedi come from samurai movies, right? I mean, originally, the inspiration for Jedi, in even the name, comes from Chitai Geki, which is the Japanese movie genre that deals with samurai. It happened to be one of George Lucas's favorite genres, the others being westerns and science fiction movies, of course. And you can see that everything comes together in Star Wars. Um, but that's not the only inspiration for the Jedi. In fact, the Jedi powers are something that came from a totally different place. They came from the novel Dune. In fact, the Jedi used to be known as the Jedi Bendu in the original script, and that got changed when the movie came out, obviously. So the movie that we saw didn't feature that, but they weren't Jedi Knights; they were Jedi Bendu, and they were supposedly part of the Empire until they all got cast out. But their role in the Empire was very similar to that of the Bene Gesserit, except for they weren't all female. That's pretty much the only difference, really. In fact, you can see remnants of the Bene Gesserit in the very first movie that came out in 1977 with Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan uses the Bene Gesserit voice. That's the Jedi mind trick. And if we look at how Obi-Wan fights, he's also very quick and precise, just like the Bene Gesserit are supposed to be. Now, of course, they didn't get the effects right for that. We had to wait a few decades to see actual Jedi fighting in the way they should have been. But these are the two key powers that the Bene Gesserit sisters have in the Dune books. They have the power to control people's minds with their voice, and they have the power to control their own bodies.
These are
To
not the droids you're looking for.
exactly, that's the voice. That's Paul Atreides' mother talking to the Fremens and mind tricking them, basically. But we also have this aspect, the aspect of body control that comes into play with the Jedi, because Jedi always have perfect control over their body, just like the Bene Gesserit. Control over fear and their emotions, which is also an important part of the book. Paul Atreides has to control his fear and pain in the Gom Jabbar test and whatever else he does. So these are all things that heavily feature in the Jedi. Afterwards, they started getting more powers, I guess. Telekinesis was added eventually, and so on. But these were the key staples of what it meant to be a Jedi. So obviously, where did that come from? Well, the Bene Gesserit take their inspiration from yogic practices, and we're going to be talking about yogic practices, yoga in India, quite a bit as we delve deeper and deeper into the inspirations for the Jedi, because obviously there's a huge connection there to a lot of both the way the Jedi behave, the way the Jedi philosophy works, and also the way the some of the characters are even named. So we'll get to that in a bit. But for now, I wanted to mention something regarding the samurai roots because, as we noticed, this Jedi are essentially samurai mixed with these sort of yogic warrior monks, and they were the habit of Western monks. So there's a bit of Templar in there, but just a bit. Um, but recently, we've seen an infusion of samurai culture into the Jedi with Ahsoka. Dave Filoni has put in a lot of samurai references in there. And one of my favorites is the fact that they actually gave a name to that training technique in which the Jedi puts on a mask that blinds them and then uh, trains with the sword. And also it was a wooden sword, a boken in the show. And that name was the Zatoichi technique, which, of course, is named after the famous fictional samurai Zatoichi, the blind swordsman. So that was a great reference. I'd really like to see that. Um, I would also like to mention that even though Zatoichi is a fictional character that came out in, well, the 1940s, I guess, with the movies coming out between 1962 and 1989, there was, however, a real historical character that was a blind samurai, and his name was Toda Seigen. Um, Toda Seigen, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly a lot of historical information about him, but we do know that he lived. We do know that he lived at the beginning of the Edo period, so tail end of Sengoku, beginning of Edo period. He was already an old man by the time the Edo period kicked in. Edo Jedi being the peace period, the nearly 400 years of peace, in which the samurai started moving from warriors to a more political role, let's say. But anyway, they were still holding on to their warrior roots because this Toda Seigen, who was going blind, was tested by his lord in order to see if he can still fight. As the story goes, he was pit against a man wielding a long bow staff, and he picked up a small piece of wood, which was to represent a short sword. And as the man thrust his staff towards Todase again, he somehow grabbed it and then started slamming his stick into the other guy's head, uh, with lethal consequences, unfortunately. But that's the way samurai used to work. But anyway, that's how a blind man could technically still be a samurai and still fight.
Yeah,
Obviously,
they call that weapon a hanbo. It's a shorter bow. It's about 4 feet long.
and no, actually, it was supposed to be Kodachi. Uh, it was supposed to be Wakizashi, made out of wood,
Well,
but they didn't have those back then the same way that we have them today. They didn't sculpt them, and even a bokken was not as nicely sculpted as the ones we have today. That
no. I say boken, a hanbo.
Oh yeah, the hanbo is a well yeah, but it wasn't hanbo. I mean, I know the length of the hanbo. That was supposed to be specifically a wakizashi because this Todaseyen was a master of the short sword, the wakizashi or kodachi, and he developed this type of technique. And if you're a fan of samurai culture, Toda Seigen was allegedly one of the masters of Sasaki Kojiro, who was famous for dying to Miyamoto Musashi in that famous duel in which Miyamoto Musashi killed him with an oar. So
Hodor,
yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So that's kind of the connection. Simply a bit more famous, but yeah, there used to be at some point blind swordsman, and we kind of know that he was blind because generally when he's depicted in artwork, his eyes are white, like milk white. Probably could still see a little bit, but clearly visually impaired.
He had cataracts.
It could have been. It could have been a lot of things, actually. We don't really know because, well, medieval technology and medieval medicine doesn't really tell us much.
Yeah.
But yeah. So we talked about the Bene Gesserit, we talked about the samurai. Now let's move on to another topic, let's talk about Master Yoda. So we can go deeper into the yoga stuff. Now, obviously, Yoda and yoga sound very similar. And for a while, I thought maybe that's where it comes from, right? Yoda, yoga, but it's not really where it comes from. Um, See, there are these yogis in northern India. They used to be all over India, but now they usually exist north. And they are, um, how should I put this? They're naked sages. They're men and women who live out in the wilderness and come down into a city at one time of the year in order to perform some kind of ritual. And they are also arranged in warrior clans because these yogis are warrior monk yogis. So, in order to become a fully fledged warrior in their clan, you have to become a Yoda. That's what they call it, except for it's spelled with two D's instead of one. But that's legitimately what they call it. They call it a Yoda. So that's why Master Yoda is a great warrior. When Obi-Wan tells Luke to seek out this great warrior, that's what it means. Now, the process of becoming a Yoda is rather grueling, so to say. It implies standing in front of the banner of that particular clan which you're joining for, I think, a couple of days, holding jugs of water on your shoulder. And while you're doing that, the other members of the clan get to kick you and punch you in various areas, including the groin. And if you go through that ordeal, then you become a Yoda, a warrior in their tradition. And there's different ranks for that, of course, but that's the basic thing. Now, I think that this isn't substantiated by any interviews or anything, but I think that George Lucas definitely read about this because he read a lot about Indian lore. And it shows a little bit in the way Yoda actually trains Luke because you actually get to see Yoda making Luke do a lot of yoga asana, especially with the handstanding, that are very, very difficult. So my guess is that it's a direct reference to this in the particular movie that this happens. I think it was Empire. Uh, but yeah, this is definitely where the name Yoda appears directly in Indian culture and definitely referenced well in the movie. There's of course a lot more that can be said about the connections between Indian culture and Star Wars. In fact, a lot of character names, even names that have nothing to do with the Jedi, are part of are inspired by Indian culture. For instance, Admiral Akbar. Admiral Akbar actually comes from Emperor Akbar of the Mughal dynasty, which was a Mongolian dynasty that ruled India for hundreds of years until up until the British colonization. Actually, the British took India from these Mughals, and in fact, our modern word Mughal also comes from the Mughals, with it representing a very rich, very powerful person. So yeah. Anyway, this Emperor Akbar was quite important back in the day because he was Mongolian and he was a Muslim, but he was also very open-minded towards other religions. So he would actually host different gatherings of Hindus, yogis, um, Zoroastrian, Parsi, and Muslim Sufis, and they would encourage their discussions in a mystical and philosophical sense, which was very, very good at the time, and sparked a lot of intercultural exchange between all of these people, which is why we have a lot of Indian mystical ideas coming into Islam, even today, they're still present. A lot of influence coming even from Islam into India. In fact, there were and still are, to a certain extent, Muslim yogis, which are called fakir. I'm sorry, Ross, are you saying something? I think you're muted. No? Okay, then I'll continue. So a fakir is essentially a Muslim yogi, and it was all thanks to this king, or rather Emperor Akbar, was founded.
Like I'm just Googling on the side here. I'm
Yeah,
just because you had said Admiral Akbar's name is based off of Emperor Akbar.
yeah.
Do you have anything because they then you move back onto Admiral Akbar rather like why Emperor Akbar of this like why was it named after that? I have
I
a
think
there's a
I think
simpler
I think that
explanation.
that is basically just because George Lucas read a lot about India and he just named random characters after the stuff that he read.
Like Akbar by itself just means
The
great
great.
or greater.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it doesn't have to apply to this Emperor Akbar. I don't
Yeah,
see
but
anything backing that up.
that's true. But again, we have to realize that once again, George Lucas took inspiration from things that are relevant to,
From names, yeah, like
yeah,
a lot of names, like
but names that are relevant to the history of Buddhism. Buddhism is, of course, the most important inspiration for him and his mystical and philosophical teachings, but also
okay.
from Hinduism. So this
But
is
the
why
Akbar, I'm just sorry, but Akbar wouldn't have anything to do with Buddhism or Hinduism.
that, that
It's a
that
Muslim word.
yes, of course, but this is why I'm saying that Akbar was important because he was facilitating this cultural exchange, which was not something that was happening under his father, and definitely not was not going to happen under his brother, who was a more fundamentalist Muslim who didn't like this sort of cultural exchange. And to link it to something that I was talking about earlier, um, Akbar in his army had these warrior yogis that we still have today. So they were actually fighting for him because of his religious openness. So there's another connection there to this. And oh, well, by the way, I forgot to mention while I was talking about the warrior yogis, they're called Naga Sadhu. And of course, yeah, those of us who like the Old Republic will remember this name as being the name of the Sith Lord, Naga Sadao. So that's probably where that came from as well. I'll probably show you a picture of them later so you can see them. They're not exactly PG. Let's see. Uh, Another question here. Where does Taoism come in? Yes, Taoism is important, but it is also Taoism is a very syncretic religion. So it took up a lot of elements from Buddhism and vice versa. Buddhism, when it came to China, especially in Zen Buddhism, got a lot of Taoist influence. In fact, China is another important center of this intercultural exchange between ideas that eventually fuse into one thing. So that's where Taoism essentially comes in. You will find a lot of exchange between Zen Buddhist teachings and Taoist teachings. Not to mention the fact that Taoism actually picked up on a very important concept, which I will mention later on, which is the concept of Mount Meru, which appears in Taoist writings, also appears in Hindu writings and Buddhist writings, and that's basically how it comes from. It comes from India, um, Buddhism, and then China, where everything blends together. But we could talk about Ahsoka Tano to tie this on together. Um, the name Ahsoka is also one of a great emperor coming into being somewhere in the second century BC. Again, I'm saying this is the source because of the fact that this particular emperor is very important to the spread of Buddhism all across Asia. Emperor Ashoka ruled out of Afghanistan, ruled northern India, and he ruled over Bangladesh. And his empire was responsible for later on spreading Buddhism into China centuries after this. But let's look at King Ahsoka and see exactly what he did that was so important. Um, at the time, in the second century BCE, Buddhism was a Hindu and Indian phenomenon. Yes, Ahsoka. So
Ashoka.
yes, actually Ashoka. That's a very good. That's how you should call it. In fact, I'll probably just call him Ashoka from now on. But you know, and I like Ahsoka too. So anyway, King Ashoka or Emperor Ashoka was a great warmonger until he discovered Buddhism. He had a campaign in which he conquered an entire territory for 8 years, it seems, and then when he discovered Buddhism, he completely swore off anything related to war and violence. And he's the one that actually pushed Buddhism as a state religion in his empire, taking it from India and sort of forcing it upon his subjects. Some of his subjects were, in fact, Bactrian Greeks, brought there by Alexander the Great, funnily enough. And they were very good at building statues. So this is where we also get the Buddha statues. The way Buddha is portrayed in the techniques of building these statues came from these Greeks that were living there in somewhere around the area of modern Afghanistan. And in fact, we also have those gigantic Buddha statues which were defaced by the Taliban a few decades ago, a long time ago, but I'm sure some of you probably remember those. Um, those were also part of this long tradition. So again, this is why I believe Ahsoka comes from this particular emperor. As this empire developed, it became more and more relevant in the area, and this is also the vehicle that brought Buddhism all the way over to other places, including, well, China. I would dare say Tibet, but there were some other practices that were similar to Buddhism, or rather connected to Buddhism before in Tibet, so it's kind of iffy. And from China, Buddhism started spreading all across the rest of Asia that wasn't already influenced by Indian culture. And we can see this in the way they built temples, for instance. I think I could talk about it right now, but let me see here if I can show you. I will post a screenshot, I guess. So this is the Jedi Temple we all know and love. I'm sure it'll load in a bit. And the very next one is going to be the Temple of Angkor Wat. Now, the Temple of Angkor Wat used to be a Hindu temple, and then it became a Buddhist temple. But this type of architectural five spire,
There we go.
yeah, so this is the five spire temple design we can see in a lot of Indian and Buddhist.
Okay, so this
Uh,
just to give people, this is the original. Are we talking about this one, or are we talking about the?
no, well, both actually, because they're both. The Jedi Temple in the Star Wars movies is inspired by temples that look like Angkor Wat. In fact, Angkor Wat is the biggest temple, period, on the planet. But there are lots of other temples like it that have a central spire surrounded by four others. This is a representation of Mount Meru, which is the mythical center of the universe in Hindu mythology. This mountain sits at the center of the earth, of the world, or reality itself, and each of the pillars goes towards a different cardinal direction, uh, sometimes made out of different materials, sometimes not. And of course, nobody knows where this mountain actually is. Some say it's Mount Kailash in Tibet, some point towards a certain glacier at the origin of the Ganga. Ganges River. And it's a mythical location, but you will see this design over and over in Buddhist and Hindu temples everywhere. And this
Is
is
there is there any like spiritual implications or anything like that, or philosophical implications of the arrangement of the spires, or is it a reference to the mythology?
yes and yes, but it's similar depending, it's different depending on who you ask. So everybody seems to have opinions about what everything means. For instance, in Buddhism, like I said, each pillar represents a cardinal direction, and above the central spire is the realm of the Buddha, the pure land of the Buddha. But again, that depends on the branch of Buddhism. It's very, very complicated. They all have the same iconography, yet somehow um, they have different interpretations for it. So it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what the spiritual meaning is. They all have this idea that this is the central spire of the universe. So, and of course, this comes from Hindus. This is the mountain where Shiva lands in legends about Shiva and his otherworldly origins. When he takes human shape, this is where he comes from. And then he just goes having adventures all across India, for instance. But I when it comes to the Star Wars movies, I think it's pretty obvious since the Jedi are Buddhist monks in a way, they uh, gave them Buddhist designed temple to work with. So I thought that was a pretty neat detail on its own. And also, I was mentioning earlier that Taoism also has writings relating to Maru. How those got there? Well, it's very simple. It got them from Buddhism because of, again, the intercultural exchange. Uh, like I said, China was a fertile breeding ground for this type of discussion between Taoism, Buddhism, and a lot of other smaller sects, I would say. But I mean, there's also Confucianism and others, but those are hardly considered religions. It's complicated again. But their idea was to unify everything, to bring everything together into one coherent truth, rather than to separate and to say, ah, well, we say this, you say that. No. And I think that's also important, which is something that the Japanese didn't do when they took this stuff in, because in the ninth century of, or rather in the seventh century, they started taking in Buddhism themselves. And being Japanese, they were very sticklers about it. They were sticking to exactly how it was taught to them. They wanted the exact writing and everything, and they started having holy wars against each other, and temples started fighting each other over whose doctrine was right and whose doctrine was wrong, and who had the right sutras and who was blasphemous. It was a lot like Christianity in a way, because they were very, very tolerant with each other. So, yeah, that's it about the temples. Now, talked about Ahsoka, but we didn't talk about Ahsoka's race, right? The Togruta. And again, the Togruta are connected to these warrior monks, these Naga Babas, that I'm going to show you how exactly using visual aids. So here we have a picture of Jedi Master Shakti. Everybody knows her. Now let's have a look at a Naga Baba. What do these people look like? Or a Naga Sadhu. I think I like Naga Sadhu as the name. They have the same kind of face paint. They would often have uh, dreadlocks that are white because of different things that they put in their ashes. I'm gonna tell you where those ashes come from, but there's ashes. And they look a lot like Togruta. Um, and of course, there's women as well. So these guys apparently are inspiration for a lot of things in Star Wars, right? So you can clearly see the patterns that they draw on their faces, and even their dreadlocks resemble the design for these. So a lot that has to do with Ahsoka and her race and general Jedi things comes from that sort of area of northern India, Afghanistan, and branching into China for the Zen stuff. And the reason why I'm talking about these more than the Zen stuff is because I know that everybody knows about the Zen stuff. I mean, that's not even not even worth discussing at this point, unless you guys want to. I mean, I'm open. But yeah, so this is, of course, there's lots of other things I could talk about in this. For instance, uh, if everybody played Knights of the Old Republic 2, you remember Kreia? Her name was Darth Treya, right? Her Sith name. There was a yogi called Dattatreya. Um, of course, Chris Avalon, the writer for Knights of the Old Republic 2, also took inspiration from Nietzsche when it came to this Sith code, Sith philosophy. But the name Darth Treya definitely comes from this Dattatreya, who was a mythical guru, a mythical yogi that was not exactly very dark-sided at all. In fact, he was and still is worshipped as a deity by various groups. One of these groups, however, is a group called the Agori, which are a lot like these Naga Sadhu, except for they are engaged in even darker practices. And Dattatreya has a lot to do with the left-handed path of yoga or tantric teachings, depending on how you want to call them. So a lot of tantric movements will link themselves to Dattatreya. That doesn't mean that he, as a historical figure, was linked to anything like this. Maybe he was just a normal yogi. But over time, he was connected to these, some would call darker cults, organizations. Uh, so probably why Avalon wanted to use the name. I'm not really certain though. But yeah. And also looking at Master Shakti for a minute, again, India, we find her name being referenced as the feminine energy.
Sorry, this class is just real life inspirations, and all
Yeah,
also so far all we're getting is fictional characters and religious uh deities,
well,
and
those
like
are the inspirations.
mostly fictionalized. Like I'm sorry, I'm just not getting the
So,
point.
Darcy, I think when he means real world inspiration, he means like inspiration that came from outside of Star Wars. Like
These
real world material, not
right.
Okay,
yeah.
These are also things that, well, they don't physically exist, obviously, although Dr. Trail might have existed as a historical figure, but they are real world concepts, ideas, and yes, deities, I guess, that are outside of Star Wars, yet they find themselves in Star Wars. We find that the people who created Star Wars took inspiration from these things particularly, and they might be important to mention and take deeper dives into in order to understand what exactly they took out of, if that makes sense. Uh, they're like each of them is like a portal into finding out more about what exactly this is and how it impacted history, culture, and eventually made its way into Star Wars. Regarding the Dattatreya thing, it's kind of obvious that the name comes from there, but also, like I mentioned, Darth Treya was a Sith Lord, and Dattatreya is connected to a lot of left-handed path tantric yogic practices, which some would consider dark-sided. So does that make sense to you?
I'm sorry, not really. Like, I am trying, and I'm Googling what you're saying and like trying to pull up everything to try to like understand it better, but I'm finding much simpler explanations elsewhere.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think that it's really important as Jedi. One of the things that we do as Jedi is try to find these real world inspirations. And yes, they might not totally line up with what other authors have inspired. Like maybe Jabba is just an Arabic name. It's like maybe, it's in a lot of ways what other belief systems have done to not legitimize but create a greater amount of meaning for their path and their belief. And that's one of the steps on the path is finding these real world inspirations. And Radhun has done a really excellent job in explaining what he understands. So one of the things that we do as Jedi is by allowing people to explore these ideas, we also help them to create their own paths.
So I was going to say, there's actually a word for this in Christianity, and it's gotten a lot of flack. So please understand that I understand where some people are coming from when they look at this, and they're not really up for it, but it's called localization. And this is actually where you find people that want a black baby Jesus, want a black Jesus when he was Arab or from the Jewish. He was Jewish and from the Arab area. This is how you get a Russian looking Santa Claus when he's clearly Germanic, or a black Santa Claus or a white Santa Claus. It's called localization. And we do this in our fields in different cultures so that we do have stronger connection to the archetypes.
No, I get it. I get it. Darcy's got a fair point here. To this, I would also like to add that whatever I'm doing here is more like a sort of a encouragement for everyone to look these things up, because I really do want more people to know about these things, not just on a basic level, but to really look into these historical figures and people because they are important. So I'm mostly just using Star Wars as a vehicle to introduce these other things that are tangentially related to it or directly related to it, and depends on how you look at it, and really just bring these probably lesser known things to your attention. Personally, I just can't stop seeing connections everywhere between these things, and I think it's good. I think it's a good thing, and I think everyone can benefit from this. Not necessarily from what I'm saying right now, the information that I'm giving, but from this type of mindset, finding connections between all these different things that come together. Because then we get to learn a lot about the real world. Like, for instance, when you have somebody that's Emperor Palpatine, who was Emperor Palpatine in the real world? Was there ever an Emperor Palpatine? And the answer is yes, there were several Emperor Palpatines, right? So Palpatine becomes this archetype of the Emperor that we have to look out for, because when he takes over, things are going to be bad. And you can look into history and see the inspirations for Palpatine. You see Adolf Hitler, you see Julius Caesar, you see even Napoleon Bonaparte. was an inspiration for Palpatine. And what all these figures have in common is that they took over a republic and turned it into an empire. And they took over using charisma, and they were more or less elected to the role, depending on the political system that was actually in place. But all of them had popular support and became emperors and started waging warfare in order to secure that position. Um, George Lucas was asked in the 80s, before anything, the sequels came out, prequels, he was asked if Palpatine was a Jedi back in the day before all this happened, and he said no, he was a politician, and his name was Richard Nixon. So you can also add this to to the inspirations for Star Wars. And in fact, there's another interesting idea that we can find is Star Wars is also an anti-war movie. Funnily enough, even though the name says otherwise, but it has a lot of Lucas's anti-Vietnam War criticism. A lot of people, especially creators and artists back in the day, were of course opposed to the Vietnam War. And George Lucas was supposed to direct Apocalypse Now, a movie which was later on taken up by Francis Ford Coppola, as many of you may know, and given a special treatment. But Lucas wrote his own version and was ready to direct it. Unfortunately, he got messed up with something called Star Wars, and he couldn't, so he handed it off to Coppola. But he did put a lot of that stuff in there. Although most of it didn't make it on screen until the third movie came out. But the Ewoks were supposed to be the Viet Cong, and they were actually supposed to be there in the first movie that came out. They had this forest planet, and they were supposed to be the Wookiees, and they were just like they did in Empire. In Return of the Jedi, they were fighting against this technologically superior enemy using the jungle as their advantage. So even though it happened like decades after, Lucas did manage to sort of direct a movie that was against the war in Vietnam, eventually. Uh, so yeah, the Ewoks. There's also another interesting thing about Endor and the Ewoks themselves, I guess, but mostly about their planet. Again, this is a very roundabout thing, so please don't get mad at me. But Endor, the planet itself, the planet's name comes from the Bible. And the reason why I bring it up is because it is often used in theological discussions, funnily enough, regarding witchcraft and regarding the separation between the world of the dead and the world of the living. Now, why this is because Endor is a place where, yeah, exactly, the Witch of Endor. Uh, if everybody's familiar with it, I'll just do a short recap for those who aren't. But King Saul is fighting the Philistines, which are essentially the Greeks that were colonizing part of Palestine at the time. He wants a way to defeat them, but he can't find one, so he goes over to a witch who lives in Endor. And he has her bring out the spirit of the prophet Samuel. So the witch manages to bring up the spirit of Samuel, which tells him that he and his sons will die, and eventually this happens, and King David comes to the throne, which was also preordained by Samuel when he was alive. Now, why is this important theologically, and most importantly, where the hell is that witch coming from in Star Wars? So there is a witch on Endor in Star Wars canon, so to say, and it appears in the Ewoks TV series of places. There's the Danthomiri Night Sister living on Endor, which is the Witch of Endor. Also, I think that's the first appearance of Danthomiri Night Sister, possibly predating a lot of the other ones. I don't know if it was the books that introduced them first or this, but it was probably this. So in Star Wars, there is a witch on Endor. Now, moving on back to the actual witch of Endor and why this particular witch is important historically is because theologians will often look at this story and analyze two things. Witchcraft. Is it okay? Is it not okay to seek out somebody that has these powers and to bring back the dead? Um, is it even possible, according to Christian theology, to do this? And the answers had some pretty significant historical ramifications. For instance, King James, you may know him as the guy who commissioned the King James Bible, which I understand is very popular as a translation in America. He was also a believer in witchcraft, and also he participated in a lot of witch trials. And it was because of his influence that witch trials were, in fact, a thing in England and later on in the American colonies for a long time. In his book, The Demonology, which I recommend you all look up because it's a fascinating bit of early 1600s thinking. He believed that this witch was really bringing back the souls of the dead, and that's unnatural. Yeah, that's an unfortunate King James fact. Sorry, but it's kind of true. So anyway, King James was all for persecuting witchcraft. Now, there were other people in England, such as Reginald Scott, the author of The Discovery of Witchcraft, who were against the persecution of witches. His point of view was that witchcraft is not real, not supported by the Bible in any way, and it's all a bunch of tricks. And even this, the witch of Endor, used tricks in order to fool Saul that he was bringing back the prophet Samuel. So therefore, witches should not be persecuted. They're just people doing magic tricks. There shouldn't be any problem there. That was the other point of view. Obviously, King James, being the king, managed to impose his point of view, which is written down in his demonology book, and which unfortunately led to the deaths of hundreds of people, if not more. And this was strange because England was, in fact, a Protestant country, mostly, so many looked down upon the Catholics for their Inquisition and their practice of witch burning. They thought that that was crazy and nobody should do that, and then they started doing it themselves. So rather unfortunate. But yeah, that's the witch event where I get. Thank you all for listening to my rant, and I hope you took something valuable out of this. And you will probably, hopefully, be researching all these things.